with the format, but just so you know, in the upper left-hand corner is our download pod. There you can find information about help for audio if you're having difficulty hearing. There's also a PDF version of today's presentation right there available for you to download. You click on the name TAM Refresher Webinar Presentation and then hit Download File, and it should download for you. Below that is a note that just tells you that the audio is voice over IP. It is not a conference line. And if you have any difficulties, please enter them into the chat pod below. The chat pod is in the lower left-hand corner, and feel free to put questions, comments, and relevant information in that chat pod throughout the presentation. It looks like the voting has slowed down in the chat pod, so in the polling pod, so I'm going to take a look. We have mostly, I'd say, Tier 2 and Tier 1 participants today, a couple of sponsors, a few Mpos, and some contractor consultant vendors. And a couple people that are other. So I wonder what that is. Okay. One industry, one research organization. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Most folks are in their writing of the TAM plan phase, which makes sense. Also planning and collecting data, and some subset is coordinating with the Mpos. Not as many people doing the board buy-in or accountable executive approval at this time. And then our third poll is how many FTA webinars, trainings, and presentations have you attended? And most of you have been through two to 5, some 5 to 10, and I'm surprised there are a number of you that have not been to any of our webinars before. But I welcome you just the same. And for those of you that have been to all of them, you will hear a lot of the same information here. This is the TAM Refresher course. It is not a new content course. It is repackaged material that we have presented in the past. Cindy has a question about submitting on the polls. And Cindy, if you click one of the radio buttons to the left of the answer, it should automatically submit. There's not a submit button. Hopefully that helps. But we're about to go start the presentation now. Thank you for submitting your information on the polls. And feel free to ask questions in the chat pod. It looks like this connection is kind of slow. All right, there we go. All right. So I'm Ms. Shadoni Smith, the TAM Program Manager. Today we're going to talk about reminding and clarifying rule requirements, highlighting resources available in these areas, TAM requirements, targets and their relevance to planning requirements, and highlighting some Ntd reporting information. And then lastly, we'll get to the questions that you guys may have. So going right into the TAM requirements. So the rule says that all recipients or subrecipients of Federal Chapter 53 that own, operate, or manage capital assets used in the provision of public transportation are subject to the TAM rule. So that includes all assets in the provision of public transportation, not just federally funded assets. I'm just adding a couple of clarifying points in the presentation to add some, I guess, depth to what was in the rule and also answer some questions that I have received over the 2 years since it was published. So assets, the capital assets, it applies to all of them, not just federally funded assets like some other of FTA programs, which only ask for inventory of federally funded assets. Also, the assets that it applies to must be in revenue service. So if you are building something, building some service, building an extension, but it's not yet in revenue service, then it does not necessarily need to be in your TAM plan until it is in revenue service. Non-dedicated assets such as taxis are not included in your TAM plan for the simple fact that you cannot guarantee that the same vehicle will be used in your service, so it's non-dedicated to your service, so it doesn't have to be in your asset inventory. Also, I had a question about Vanpools and those Vanpools that are operated by a grantee or the assets used by the Vanpool are owned by a grantee do need to be included in your TAM plan. So as a general rule of thumb, if you report it to NTD, you'll probably report it to TAM. Now, that's just a rule of thumb. That's not a hard and fast rule. I'm just giving you guys kind of a starting point to go from. Now, I've received a lot of questions about 5310s and the applicability of the TAM rule on them since they are a new group for NTD specifically collecting information. And in fact, we have a frequently asked question that goes into this into much more precise language. But basically, if it's open door service and it is not client-based, then it is subject to the TAM rule. So if it's open door, if anybody or any cross-section of the population can use the service, then it needs to be included in your TAM plan. Those 5310 subrecipients that receive 5310D, the alternatives to public transit funding would be exempt. And also coordinating services with a 5310 or with a 5311 does not automatically make that operator subject to the TAM rule. It doesn't mean they won't be subject to it, but it's not an automatic add-in. And again, I direct you to our frequently asked questions. There are, well, I think it's one specifically that's on 5310s, but several on what needs to be included or who needs to be included in my TAM plan. So most of you have seen my presentations before, so this is not going to be a shocking slide for you. I like to kind of itemize our deliverables in two different types. There's process deliverables and reporting deliverables. The process deliverables are those that FTA does not collect, and the reports are those that are collected or are submitted to the NTD. So the TAM plan elements, we have 9 elements that are due for Tier 1 operators and 4 elements that are applicable for Tier 2 operators and group plan sponsors. Just clarifying, also you'll see there's a URL here. That is our TAM Plan page on our TAM website, which goes into more detail on TAM plans, gives you some more specifics and more resources where you can find out information about TAM plans. But just highlighting a couple of things, 5310 recipients and American Indian tribes are always Tier 2 operators unless they operate rail. So regardless of the number of vehicles a 5311 may have, they're Tier 2. Some best practices I'm also providing in here. an MOU or an MOA can alleviate a lot of questions regarding shared capital responsibility. So I get a lot of questions from operators. So I have, 30% responsibility here, or I own this building but they own that building, or I own the building but they own the land. How do I do this in my TAM plan? And I understand it's somewhat nuanced and can be confusing, but each TAM plan is really very specific to the operators that are covered under them. So I would suggest that if you have shared capital responsibility, that some sort of agreement amongst those with that responsibility might be a way of clearly identifying and delineating who's responsible for what. Another clarification for element 4, which all TAM plans will include, the investment prioritization, does apply to all funding sources, not just federal funding sources. One point I do want to point out also is that the TAM rule allows for flexibility. It's not a one-size-fits-all rule. These are the minimum requirements. You can always do more. There's no restriction on adding more if it is appropriate for your situation. So some other information I just wanted to share with the group that there are currently TAM plan activity codes in Trams, and they are identified based on the operator type. So Tier 1 operators would use the 127P00 ALI. Bus operators, which most likely would be Tier 2s, would use the 117P00. And more than likely, the Tier 2 and group plan sponsors, or 5310 and 5311, would use the 67P00 activity line item. Different funding programs have different allowable costs, so you definitely want to check with your region for information. But most programs like the 5307, 5311, and 5310 allow planning activities, which might include some TAM development costs, such as software and IT expenses, among others. But the key takeaway is to check with your region. Some of the other process requirements are the record-keeping requirement. The rule says you have to maintain your TAM supporting documents, which really just means for the life of the TAM plan. So for the 4 years, if you go the full cycle for the TAM plan, if you update it more often, then you just keep it at the level or for the current TAM plan. And then you should share with your state and Mpos. We'll come across that a little bit more later. And another question was about certification. TAM plans are self-certified in the certs and assurances process in grant making, and they are certified by the grantee's accountable executive. I just want to clarify that a group plan sponsor does not become the group plan accountable executive. All of the participants are still they still have accountable executives at the subrecipient level. They wouldn't sign the certs and assurances, but they, as far as the TAM requirement is concerned, they would need to approve the TAM plan. And some of this is identified in more detail in the group plan sponsor workbook, which is at this URL here, and it talks about some best practices and lessons learned in group plan development. And the current certs and assurances do reflect the TAM rule requirements. These graphics at the bottom of the screen are actually pulled directly from that group TAM plan sponsor workbook. It kind of gives you a sense of the cycle for developing a group TAM plan. Uh-oh, this did not come out right. Sorry, guys. So oversight seems to be a lot of folks are interested in this topic, understandably. And we have provided some new materials online. We have a new oversight checklist. I realize you can't see that URL. I'll make sure that you get a better copy of it when we post this online. And it is already online if you just look for Oversight Checklist or Compliance Checklist 2018 on our TAM plan. The graphics at the bottom are directly pulled from that document, and I wanted to kind of highlight those because I think that the graphic on the right, which is kind of like a conceptual model of how all of the asset elements from a TAM plan work together. So the dark blue ones are the 5 elements that a Tier 1 operator would do, and all 9 of them, so all 9 of them all together would be a Tier 1 TAM plan and how it works together, whereas the light blue are the 4 items for a Tier 2 TAM plan. Okay, thanks, David. David was telling us that if you click on the link, it takes you right to the page from this visual. So thank you for that. I'm glad because I didn't realize that it looked like this in here. So let's talk a little bit about targets and their relevance to the planning requirements. So I did want to, and I have been wanting to, and this is actually also in the group plan workbook, group plan sponsor workbook, identifying the differences between some of the terms that we use, a metric, a performance measure, and a target, as well as a goal. Those all are slightly different. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they really mean something different. So FTA has set 4 performance measures. Those are immutable. They are not going to change. They're in the regulation. They're required. And they're listed there kind of in the middle of your screen for the 4 asset categories: equipment, rolling stock, infrastructure, and facilities. Those are the performance measures. Now, what is changeable are the metrics and the targets. So the metric is just your calculated value. So you may have a calculated value for rolling stock for, let's say, passenger vans. You may have some figure that says how many passenger vans are above the useful life benchmark. That is not your target. That's your metric. That is the raw calculation of the performance measure. Your target is, where do I want to be for this performance measure? So it's more of a forecast saying, next fiscal year, I want the target to either move in this direction or be at this value. And that's more of a, I would say, internal kind of decision, how you set your targets, because they are more, they could be more, goodness, what is the word I'm looking for? Aggressive, or they could be easier to achieve. I don't want to say easy, because they're not easy, but the more likely to achieve. So I just wanted to take a few seconds to kind of talk about the differences between those, and also goals. The reason I bring this up is I've seen a few scenarios where folks have identified their targets, but they're actually goals. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your performance management for TAM. The NTD only collects a numerical value for targets. So a little bit about the useful life benchmarks. So for 2 of the performance measures, useful life benchmarks are part of the measure. And it's your expected life cycle or accepted period of use in service for an asset as determined by the transit provider. it should take into account your unique operating environment, and I needed this to be in red. I apologize for that, but the useful life benchmark, also called the ULB, is not the same as the useful life for FTA grant programs. The ULB is estimated as your maximum operating age, and is estimated through term. The useful life for grant programs is your minimum age to be eligible for federal funding. So they're really measuring two different things. I realize they're using similar terms, but they're very different. Also, the useful life benchmark is only used in target setting for TAM. It has absolutely no impact on your funding eligibility or grant applications. It is strictly used for setting targets for TAM. It represents a vehicle replacement cycle, or your estimated vehicle replacement cycle, and can be customized, or you can use FTA's defaults. FTA defaults you can find at this URL at the bottom of your screen. We call them the ULB cheat sheet, and the NTD will pre-fill the FTA defaults by fleet asset type. You will have to manually go in there and change the default ULB in your NTD form in order to use a customized ULB. The acceptance of your report is acceptance of your customized ULB by FTA. If your ULB is way off, or it looks like it could have been a typo, one of your NTD validators may contact you just to verify. And if it is out of a certain margin certain margin, they may ask you for justification on how you came up with that customized useful life benchmark. So some performance management considerations. Metrics may change from year to year. That's just your raw number estimating your performance measure. It could change depending on the size and quality of your data. So better data, you may actually end up with more information that appears like your performance is increasing or decreasing, but it's really just your data has gotten better. But that does not directly equate to shifting targets, because the targets are forecast values. Your metrics are more realized values. Your targets project where you're going to be, and it represents your ideals and your policies. So how does this relate to the performance-based planning and programming? Well, the Mpos, the planning requirements also, okay, let me start that over. Planning agencies, Mpos, and state DOTs also have a requirement to set TAM targets. So they may coordinate, or it says regional targets are coordinated with each provider but are not required to be the same. So what that means is that the Mpos target does not necessarily have to match the operator's target, and vice versa. The Mpos initial TAM targets were to be set within 180 days of receiving targets from their transit providers. Now that's just the initial TAM targets. Mpo revisits their targets to coincide with the schedule for updates to the Mpo planning product. So an Mpo cycle is typically more than annual, whereas operators will be required to update their targets annually and report them to NTD. And then for more details, gosh, this just really visually did not come out well, guys. I apologize. Please take a look at the Mpos frequently asked questions and their PBPP webpage. We also have a link on our TAM webpage if that's not coming through, and I apologize again for that. So let's talk just really quickly about timelines here. So as I mentioned before, well, actually I didn't mention the date, but I said 180 days. The January 2017, all grantees, transit operators were required to set their state of good repair targets. So that means you should have already gone through your target setting effort once, definitely, maybe twice, depending on your fiscal year. Now, FTA did not collect that information, and we are taking your word that you have collected those targets. However, your planning organizations are dependent on getting copies of those targets in order to set theirs. So coordinating with them and sharing with them your targets, either your first targets or your first and your second targets, so that they can meet their deadlines, that 180 days, is pretty critical. And those targets are going to be updated annually based on your fiscal year. Only the first targets had a set-in-stone date of January 2017. And we all know October 2018, the TAM Plan must be compliant. And then every 4 years after that, it needs, at least every 4 years, it must be updated in its entirety. And there's also the opportunity to do amendments in between those updates, but it's up to the grantee to determine, or the group plan sponsor to determine, what is significant enough to be an update versus an amendment. And then the NTD reporting starting in report year 18, which depending on your fiscal year can be calendar date October 2018, January 2019, or April 2019. They will start collecting the updated asset inventory. They will start mandatory collection of the TAM asset inventory, condition reporting, and TAM targets. This year, you can optionally report that information. But starting in report year 18, you will be required to report that information. That first year, you will have 1/4 of your facility assessments to report, and then another quarter every year until all have been done and you start the cycle again. So the following report year 2019, you will report the same information plus a narrative report. The narrative report is where you can do your, well, it's not verbal because it's written, but you can do your justification or your explanation for the data and the numbers that you report in your condition, your TAM targets, and your asset inventory. So now I'm going to shift over into highlighting some NTD stuff. So we talked about the two different types of reports, or two different types of deliverables, the process that is not collected by FTA, and then the reports that are submitted to FTA through the NTD. So TAM and NTD information is similar, but it is not the same. The NTD omits equipment and other service vehicle, where TAM includes non-vehicle equipment assets in their inventory. The NTD is reported annually, and the TAM plan is updated at least every 4 years. So the TAM inventory may become out of date, whereas the NTD inventory will be pretty accurate if you're updating it every year. The NTD, you only report on assets with full or partial capital replacement responsibility, with the exception of passenger stations and track. You have to report all of those, regardless. For TAM, the inventory includes all assets used in the provision of public transportation, whether you have full or partial capital responsibility or not. And that's in the inventory, not the condition assessment. The NTD hierarchy and classifications are standard, so there are certain asset types that are defined in the NTD, whereas TAM hierarchy and asset classes are flexible. The asset categories are standard, but the classes and hierarchy are flexible. So those are just some of the similarities yet differences between NTD and TAM. So further talking about some of the data reporting requirements for the NTD, you will supply or you will provide your projected performance targets for the following fiscal year on Form A90. The targets submitted in report year 2018 forecast where you'll be in report year 2019. So it gives a guesstimate, for lack of a better word. That's not even a real word, but let's go with that. The asset inventory and condition assessments, your useful life benchmarks for rolling start and equipment on A30 and A35. Age is automatically calculated from the year of manufacture. Condition assessments for facilities are reported to on A15. Flow zones for infrastructure for rail fixed guideway only are reported on A20. This is getting on my nerves. Okay, so TAM inventory is more inclusive than the inventory reported to the NTD. It's the inventory of all assets used to provide service, whether the provider owns, jointly procured, or owned by a third party. This is just another way of saying the same thing we did before, but of course the new information didn't make it onto the slide, and basically I say that temporary facilities, i.e. trailers, do not require a condition assessment. If it doesn't have a foundation, it's not a facility, but it would be a piece of equipment. So let's talk a little bit more about the Ntd and Cam Crosswalk. You can find this online at our on our TAM webpage. Just type in TAM Ntd Crosswalk, and I think it's also on one of our frequently asked questions. It's a subset of that, but basically it tells you where different types of assets and their ownership type, where they would fall, whether or not you would include it, and the categories are: would you include it in your TAM Plan inventory? Would you include it in your TAM Plan condition assessment? Would you include it in your NTD inventory and condition assessment? And would you include it in your state of good repair targets? So those are kind of the four categories, and then you go down the list and it says yes, no, yes, no. So revenue vehicles is pretty much yes across the board, except for a third-party owned vehicle with no direct capital responsibility. You would not include them in your condition assessment for the TAM plan, nor would you include them in your state of good repair targets. There is an asterisk under the NTD inventory, and that just means you would do a representative vehicle. So this might be like a taxi like we talked about before. The equipment is, I think, pretty straightforward, but it says if you have non-revenue vehicles, so service vehicles, you would include them across the board as vehicles, unless they're third-party owned and you would not include them in anything. Equipment over $50,000, you would include in your TAM plan, but you would not include in your NTD, or excuse me, on the NTD or in your targets. And if it's third-party owned, you wouldn't include it at all. Equipment under $50,000, you don't include anywhere. For facilities, it's all of the above included in your TAM plan and your NTD inventory, and only those that you have direct capital responsibility for or own would you include in your condition assessments or your state of good repair targets. Infrastructure that is other than rail fixed guideways, so ferries or BRT, you would include in your TAM plan and your condition assessment if you own or have direct capital responsibility. but you would not include in the NTD or the state of good repair targets. However, rail fixed guideway you would include across the board unless it's third party and you have no direct capital responsibility, then you would not include it in your condition assessment or your state of good repair targets. So I think I've beat that to death there, but I just wanted to make sure that we walk through it together in case some questions came up. So this is a slide I borrowed from Maggie, the NTD program manager, and it just talks about the different forms and when they're required and when they're optional. So the facility forms, A10 and A15, the transitway mileage form, A20, the vehicle inventory forms, A30 and A35, and the target forms, the A90. And then it also has a little bit more information about the asset inventory module, or that looks like that's the link there for you to get more information on the NTD. I would recommend you take a look at the the policy manual just to get a sense. All right, so for group plan reporting to the NTD, a state sponsor will manage the TAM requirements in the same manner as current subrecipient reports. So each subrecipient has an appropriate asset inventory form added to their report package. Subrecipients who currently report directly will continue to report directly. New TAM-only reporters, so 5310 subrecipients, will be managed by the state. There is only one A90 form per group plan because there's only one set of targets. Unless a sponsor decides to do more than one group plan, then they will have more than one A90. Each target form is associated with a specific group plan. Some of the narrative reporting requirements, it will be mandatory beginning in report year 2019 after TAM Plan is in place. And it's also submitted to the NTD through an upload feature. It talks about the changes in conditions since the last report. You could talk about progress on your targets, or if you didn't make your targets, why, things that have changed. And it's a chance to provide context. There's an example format online at the hyperlinked narrative report there. And then this is just another way to showcase the schedule for when things need to be reported to the NTD. This is from Maggie's presentation, and it just kind of shows you the quarter required condition assessments all the way to the right on the bottom until you are fully condition assessed, and then you start again. So with that, I am actually going to ask another poll really quickly. And the poll is, did you find this refresher useful? And if you did, would you like to see this offered again? Now, I know you're already online, so you're having it right now, or you're participating right now, so maybe you wouldn't necessarily need to see it yourself again. But if you thought it was valuable and something that other people could take part in, because, you know, not everybody could register, not everybody could get in today, let me know. On our final Q&A, when I start going through the questions in the next slide, there will be a Q&A pod in your lower hand corner, and you could add comments in there as far as topics you'd like me to cover in the next one, or things that I could do to help right now. So it looks like everybody has already voted overwhelmingly. You guys found it useful. Thank you very much. And you think I should offer it again? Okay. So I'm going to go to the Q&A now. You can still type into the question pod. into the chat pod, which is now at the top of your screen, but I will bring your attention to the lower left-hand corner of the screen. That is a QA pod. In there, I would like you to specifically give me suggestions on topics that you would like to see covered in the next version of this, or resources that I can develop to help you in your current state of implementation. Thank you. And for those of you that are presenting today and are like, well, I don't want to sit through another webinar, if I do this again, which I probably will since you guys overwhelmingly suggested, is I'd just post the Q&A from both of them so that you wouldn't have to sit through the whole webinar either in a recording form or in live form. So yes, I care about you guys enough to not make you sit through this all over again. But that's why these topics are super important for me to know. All right, thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ursula to go through the Q&As.
All right, so we're going to start at the top of the questions that were written down. Deborah Stevens had a question. What about contingency vehicles?
What about contingency vehicles? This may have been,
It was the very first question that was asked.
All right, Dora. Deborah? Okay, so contingency vehicles, I'm not sure what that's about. Let me see if I can really quickly find out what you're talking about. Maybe in the tier determination, I think that's where I've had that question asked before, if the contingency vehicles count in determining which tier you are, and no, they do not. If it's an emergency vehicle or it's a spare, it does not count in terms of determining whether or not you're a Tier 1 or Tier 2. Tier 1 or Tier 2 is the number of vehicles you have in peak service. I hope that that answered your question. If it did not, Deborah, please, I see you're typing right now, so hopefully that answers your question. All right.
And then Jerry Chambers asked, are leased vehicles required to be included? I'm assuming that's included in the TAM plan. And should software over 50,000 be included?
Okay, so two separate questions. I'm trying to find it where I can find it. It's after Deborah? It's before Deborah? It's
after Deborah.
Okay. All right, sorry guys. We're trying to figure out here. Okay. All right, so the second question is actually a little easier to answer. The software, so that's one of the cases where I would say this is where the flexibility of the TAM rule is valuable, because software is not explicitly an asset category. It is covered under infrastructure in terms of quote-unquote system, and that's where we suggest you put it if you decide to include it. From anecdotally and from my experience with talking with other grantees, this is a really big part of your budgets and your expenses, so it makes sense to include it. However, the rule does not require you to. So if that is the case, the answer of should software over 50,000 be included, from a strictly regulatory standpoint, no, it is not required. From a common sense standpoint, anything over $50,000 is a pretty significant investment. I mean, it depends on what type of operator you are, but it's still a pretty significant investment, and you want to make sure that it is kind of in the line of sight of your leadership in terms of its importance in keeping a state of good repair. So I would think you'd want to include it, but strictly regulatorily, no. And I haven't answered the second part, the leased vehicles. I'm going to have to get back to you on that. That's a question that I have been asked many times before, and the answer kind of is it depends on how it's leased. Are these dedicated leased vehicles? If so, I think they should be included, but I want to get back to you on that. So, Jerry, I'll get back to you.
And that kind of wraps into Randy's question. If you fund Vanpool programs that use leased vehicles through a third party, do you need to include them in your TAM plan and inventory?
If you fund Vanpool programs that are leased through a third party, do you need to include them? So these are your vehicles and your program. You're operating the program, but it's just different contractual relationships, and I think it would still meet that threshold to include. Where did I have it? You're operating the Vanpool. If you are just subsidizing, that's one thing, but if you're actually operating the Vanpool, then it would be included.
And this one is coming from Gregory Skillman. Is our paratransit service contractor included in our TAM planning?
The contractor or the vehicles? The TAM plan is about your assets. It's not about your contracts per se. A lot of contracting questions come up because people want to know what needs to be included. But, I mean, if you go back to kind of like the real basic concept of asset management, you want to include the assets that are going to be a drain on your funds because you're trying to balance the condition of those assets with the funding availability. So just going way back to like the basic TAM concepts, using that and then extrapolating forward, would that make a difference for your paratransit contract service?
Okay.
So I didn't really answer your question, but I kind of gave you some way of answering it yourself, I think. And if I didn't, we could talk about it later, or you can talk to your regional person and we can get into a lot more detail about it.
Okay, so this comes from Jonah Friedman. The Federal Register states that group plan sponsors are not required to provide elements 5 through 9 on slide 7. I think I heard that sponsors are also expected to have those items.
That's incorrect. Group plan sponsors that are sponsoring a Tier 2 plan only have to do a Tier 2 plan for their participants. If the group plan sponsor is a Tier 1 operator, then they will have 2 TAM plans they're responsible for. A Tier 1 TAM plan that includes their own assets, and a Tier 2 group plan which covers their participants' assets. All group plans are Tier 2 plans. But I want to go back up to Carrie Camp said something about, again, difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2. What was that about? Is that a question, or is that a response to something that was happening before? You don't know? Okay. All right, Carrie, if you're still with us, can you clarify what that question was, or if it really was a question, or it was just a comment back to someone? All right, go ahead.
All right. So Eric Oparko asked, the TAM compliance checklist reference FTA TAM guide report number 027, but it looks like report 098 is an updated TAM plan guide. There is also a TCRP report 172. All of these guides are similar, but which document is the best guide to use for writing our TAM plan?
It depends, Eric. If you are a Tier 1 operator, which I think you are, then the report 098 is, that's the updated TAM plan guide. That's the 2012 asset management guide that was updated based on the final rule. And it's a very comprehensive asset management guide. TCRP Report 172, I don't know off the top of my head what that is. Maybe it's, yeah, I don't know what it is. But I assume that they're all valid guides. And then this TAM guide report number 027, that doesn't look familiar to me either, but you said it's an FTA report number. So Eric, I am going to look it up right now and take a look and see what it is, because I don't know it off the top of my head, and I probably should. Okay, 098 is the Asset Managed Guide. 0092 is the Small Providers Asset Management Guide. What is 027? Oh, John says that report 027 was basically replaced with 098. Okay, so 098 is the updated version of 027, is basically what that comes, if that is correct. Because I couldn't find 027, and I don't know what 172 is. Rigorous.
All right. So going back to Carrie Camp, what determines a Tier 1 and a Tier 2 organization?
Okay, so there are several slides that talk about tier determination. There's also a checklist on our TAM page that talks about tier determination, and I will direct you to those locations to take a look, but it's revenue vehicles and peak service. I'll give you that clue. Next question.
Martin Battistelli?
Sure.
Apologize. Should the target be where do we want to be, or where do we expect to be by the end of the year, given the funding and contracts in place for rolling stock and service vehicles?
That's up to you, Martin. That's why I said that targets are really more about your ideals and your policies, because you may have a policy at your agency that says, let's be aspirational. Where do we want to be? You know, let's set targets for, you know, the direction that we're going. And other organizations may be, what can we achieve in 12 months, period? I want to be 100% certain we're going to make our target. And neither is wrong, and neither is regulated by FTA. Targets are completely and 100% a grantee activity. You're not rewarded for making it, and you're not punished for missing it.
All right, so Darwin asked, was the ULB cheat sheet updated for 2018, or are the criteria by revenue vehicle still the same name?
So it wasn't updated because the term update has not been completed yet, and that is what we use to estimate or to calculate the ULBs. So term, you guys may be familiar, the Transit Economic Requirements Model is going through an update. We're adding some vehicle types, and we're updating some of the decay curves to more accurately represent modern assets and their ability to, I guess, their condition wearing ability. So once that is updated, the ULBs will also be updated. But as of right now, they have not been updated since, I think, 2016 when we did the final rule and published the ULBs. But if you have some suggestions or you want to share with us some of your calculations on replacement cycles that you have learned in your agency or industry, we are more than welcome. We more than welcome that. And, in fact, we encourage it because that information will only help us to be more accurate in our estimates. Oh, my gosh, we only have 4 minutes left. Yikes. Folks, if we don't get to your question, I will get to your question eventually. I guess I'll have to send out an email to everyone with the questions and answers. And also, I'll probably publish it on our webpage along with next webinar's Q&A. So maybe one or two if they're easy. If they're easy questions, let's see what we can get through.
Right. When are the TAM 11 performance measures due? From Al Karoma.
When are the TAM 11 performance measures due? I don't know what that means. TAM 11. All right. Well, the TAM targets are due at the end of your fiscal year, and they are reported to Ntd with your Ntd report. If you're talking about something else, you'll have to clarify that, Al.
Should we include as many facilities as we can in the Form A15, even if the condition assessment is not complete yet? And Martin asked this question.
Yes.
Are Mpos required to revisit/update TAM targets annually if they develop a transportation improvement plan annually? And that's from Michelle.
Michelle, I would direct you to ask that question of the planning office. I don't know 100% what the planning requirements are. I'm the TAM program manager, and I can really only give you answers on that program explicitly like that. But I would suggest you contact Dwayne Weeks or Ken Cervenka to get answers, or contact your regional point of contact and have them raise that question. It looks like there was a question up here, can ULB be less than grant life? Again, I think what Martin is asking is, can the useful life benchmark be less than the useful life value? And the customized ULB could be, but there would be no real value to an agency to customize their ULB to be less than their grant useful life, because one, the ULB has no impact on the grant eligibility. You still would not be able to replace vehicles any sooner, and you would always miss your targets because all of your vehicles will be older than your ULB. So in a way, it would paint a really dire picture, and it would maybe give the impression that your agency didn't know how to set realistic replacement cycles. If your ULB was so much less than what you could possibly attain. But those are kind of questions, or those are kind of things that are more philosophical. And I'd be happy to talk about them offline, but we have reached the 3 o'clock time frame, and Adobe is trying to kick me out. So for those of you that I did not get a chance to answer your questions, I will send you guys an email with the Q's and A's. And for those that submit topics for the next webinar, thank you very much. I may contact you directly to get clarification if I don't know. And with that, I thank you for your time this afternoon, and I hope you have a wonderful day.